Do you hear that? No. Don't tilt your head. Don't move closer to your own walls. Just listen. Stay perfectly still. Because if they know you're listening, they'll talk louder. That's how it starts. First a whisper, then a word. And before you realize it, you're not just listening anymore. You're answering. You think buildings forget the people who live inside them? You think concrete doesn't keep score? You think these places we pass through, apartment towers, crumbling houses, schools long abandoned, don't keep a memory of what happened in their shadows? That's where you're wrong. I shouldn't even be telling you this. In fact, it's dangerous that I'm even speaking it aloud, because I've learned something: knowledge spreads like mold. Once you know about them, once you give them shape with your voice, you're marked. Maybe you'll laugh. Maybe you'll close this and go back to your bright, well-lit life. But maybe, hours from now, when you're brushing your teeth, when the faucet squeaks and the mirror fogs up, you'll hear something. Something soft. Something just beneath the surface of silence. A whispered, "That's how it happened to me. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen. I was just broke, desperate, trying to make rent and keep my head above water." That building, the one I'm talking about, it looked like nothing. A rectangle of gray concrete stacked against a street of cheap takeout joints and liquor stores. The kind of place you drive past 100 times and never notice. I didn't move in expecting anything other than paper-thin walls and maybe roaches. But the walls there aren't just thin. They breathe, they remember, and they talk. You ever stand too close to a wall and hear a vibration you can't explain? Like a conversation happening in the next room, only no one's home? I brushed it off the first time. Told myself it was plumbing. Told myself it was neighbors. Told myself anything except the truth. Because the truth, that the building knew I was there, that's not something you can accept without giving up a part of your sanity. That I survived what no one else did. That's not bragging. That's not courage. It's confession. People who live there don't get out. They fade. They vanish. They get written into the foundation, like their lives were never more than footnotes for the building's appetite. I don't have evidence you can hold in your hands. No photographs. No tapes. The building eats proof. All I have is my voice, and even that feels thinner every time I tell this story. That I shouldn't even be speaking it, but someone needs to know before it happens again. The strangest part? Nobody really believes the place is cursed. The landlord keeps renting it. People keep moving in. Nobody questions the turnover. Nobody questions the quiet. That's how it hides, behind normalcy, behind the mundane. You think you'd recognize evil by the smell of sulfur, by flickering lights, by shadows stretched too long. But evil doesn't wear a costume. Sometimes evil is just drywall, concrete, paint flaking off ceilings. Evil is the place you sleep, and it whispers to you while you dream. And here's the cruelest thing. The whispers don't sound threatening at first. They sound like secrets, like comfort, like something that knows you, something that remembers you. You lean in because it feels good to be acknowledged, to be seen. That's how it gets you. That's how it starts. That I didn't believe the stories either. I laughed when people online mentioned it. Another internet myth, another haunted building creepypasta. I thought I was above it. I thought I was untouchable. But the night I leaned my ear against the wall and heard my own name whispered back, my own voice, soft and patient on the other side of the plaster, that was the night I stopped laughing. That was the night I learned the walls don't just whisper. They listen. They remember. And sometimes, they answer. That I didn't believe the stories either. Not until the walls spoke back. When I first moved in, the building didn't feel like a horror story. It felt like survival. $800 a month for a one-bedroom in the city? That was practically a miracle. No credit checks, no background screening, no judgmental landlords side-eyeing my paycheck stubs. Just a handshake, a signature, and a key. I told myself I'd only stay a year, maybe less. Long enough to get my life back in order. Long enough to breathe without debt crushing my lungs. That IT wasn't glamorous. The walls were jaundiced with age, yellow creeping into corners where paint had given up. The ceiling fan rattled like it was held together by prayers, and the elevator carried a permanent, out-of-order sign that felt less like maintenance and more like an obituary. But that's what you expect in a place like this. You trade comfort for cost. You shrug and tell yourself, it's fine. It's temporary. At first, it really was just normal city life problems. The guy above me must have weighed 300 pounds and had a passion for midnight pacing. His footsteps shook dust loose from the ceiling in little flurries, like gray confetti for my insomnia. Across the hall lived a single mom with a baby who cried like it was rehearsing for opera. The pipes groaned, the lights flickered, the radiators hissed. All the ordinary symphony of a cheap apartment. But beneath that noise was a quiet that didn't belong. The hallways always seemed empty, even during the day. I'd walk to the mailbox and feel like the air was thicker there, like it didn't want to be disturbed. I started timing myself, counting how long it took me to cross from my door to the stairwell, just to distract from the way the silence pressed in. The landlord, Mr. Kane, was a wiry man with nicotine-stained fingers and the smile of someone who'd learned how to fake friendliness for a living. He greeted me the first day with a voice rough as gravel. "Unit 3B, huh? Lucky you. Best airflow in the whole building." I almost laughed. The place smelled like mold and dust, and I doubted airflow had ever been its selling point. The maintenance guy, Eddie, was the opposite. Too cheerful, like he was auditioning for a sitcom no one was filming. He whistled when he fixed things, even when the job didn't call for it. The first week, my kitchen sink spat up brown water, and Eddie crouched under the pipes humming off-key. When I asked how long he'd been working here, he grinned. "Long enough. Buildings like this, they get under your skin. You'll see." He winked as if that was reassuring. My neighbors became familiar in fragments. A door slamming, a muttered curse in the stairwell, the faint sound of TV laughter leaking through walls. They were ghosts of the living kind, present, but distant. You never saw them for long. A nod in the laundry room, a polite "hey" when passing in the hall, and then back into their caves. That's city life, right? Everyone minding their business. Or maybe everyone avoiding something. There was one man, though, an older tenant named Harris who always sat in the lobby like he was guarding it. He wore a faded cap and smoked even though the sign said not to. I remember once, while waiting for my takeout, I asked him how long he'd lived there. He squinted at me through the smoke. "Long enough," he said, "but not long enough to know everything. Don't go looking too deep. Curiosity's what gets you hurt here." He laughed after, but it wasn't a joke. His eyes didn't match his grin that I brushed it off. People love to exaggerate when they're stuck in places like this. It makes the boredom easier to carry. And besides, I had my own problems, rent, bills, the kind of loneliness that buzzes in your chest when the city lights go out. The building was just a backdrop, for walls and a door that barely locked. Nothing remarkable, still. Sometimes when I turned the key late at night, I'd swear I felt the hall watching me. Not just empty, expectant, like the air held its breath until I stepped inside. There was an urban legend, too. Harris muttered it once when he was drunk, something about people going missing in the building years back. The kind of missing where no one bothers to ask questions, he slurred. Eddie joked about it, too, saying, "If you hear whispers, don't answer them. Might be the rent collector." He laughed like it was nothing, but I noticed he wouldn't meet my eyes after I didn't care about the rumors. Not then. I needed a roof, not ghost stories. I had bills, not demons. Legends don't matter when your stomach growls louder than your fear that I didn't care about the rumors. I should have. The first time I heard it, I told myself it was nothing. Just pipes. Old buildings breathe. They complain. The walls expand and contract. The radiators hiss. The plumbing groans. Everyone knows that. You don't live in a place like mine and expect silence. It was late, past midnight, and I was sitting on the couch scrolling on my phone, trying to convince myself that insomnia was a lifestyle choice and not a symptom. That's when I noticed it. A faint sound, softer than a sigh, threading through the plaster behind me. At first it was so low, I thought it was the hum of the fridge. But then I realized it wasn't steady. It rose and fell. It pulsed, like speech. A whisper. I muted my phone. The apartment seemed to lean in around me. The sound was coming from the wall, the one that backed against the hallway. I pressed my ear closer, holding my breath that it wasn't words. Not then, just a murmur, like water rushing through pipes. I pulled back, embarrassed by the quick flutter in my chest. Thin walls, I told myself. Somebody's talking in the hall. I went to the door, opened it. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the air stale and still. That was night 1 the third night. It wasn't just murmurs. I'd wake up at 2:13 a.m., always the same time, with the sound scratching faintly at the walls near my bed. Like someone was standing right behind the plaster, lips pressed to the paint. The voices were almost words now, but slippery. They slid away the harder I tried to understand them. Sometimes it was like laughter muffled underwater. Other times it was almost crying. I told myself it was sleep deprivation. I'd been working late shifts, my body clock shattered. When you're tired enough, even silence has a voice. But it didn't stop. Daylight made it easy to laugh about. I'd make coffee, the sun would creep through the blinds, and the whole apartment would seem ordinary again. The ceiling fan rattling, the baby crying down the hall, the TV from upstairs. Normal noise. Real noise. Daylight turned the whispers into a silly story I told myself in the shower. But at night, when the city dulled and the hum of traffic faded, the building revealed itself that I started hearing tones. Cadence. The rise and fall of sentences. Words brushing against meaning, but never fully forming. Please. Stay. Listen. Or maybe I only thought that's what I heard, because the human brain can't handle nonsense for long. We force meaning onto chaos. We make monsters out of shadows, words out of static. The second week, I couldn't ignore it. One night, lying in bed, I heard it as clear as if someone were kneeling at the other side of the wall, a whispery chuckle. Not a random sound, not plumbing. Laughter. My laughter. I bolted upright, heart slamming against my ribs. I fumbled for my phone, turned on the flashlight, swept it across the room like it could burn the shadows away. Nothing. Just clothes in piles, cracked paint, dust floating like tiny silver ghosts. It was 3 a.m. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the TV buzzing static, remote slipping from my hand. A draft woke me. At least, I thought it was a draft. The air felt colder, heavier. The apartment seemed to tilt. And then, cutting through the hush, the whisper rose again. Closer. Sharper. Not from the wall this time, but from the thin stretch of air directly behind me. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. My skin prickled like every nerve was being tugged at once. And then I heard it. My name. Whispered so softly it was almost tender. Whispered in a voice that was my own. After that night, the whispers stopped pretending. They weren't random anymore. They weren't murmurs or laughter or half-formed syllables I could dismiss as plumbing or imagination. They became words, sentences. And the worst part wasn't just that I could understand them. It was that they understood me. Don't leave the lights on. You're wasting money again. Remember the time you almost drowned in the river? Private things. Memories I never told anyone. Thoughts I'd buried so deep, I'd almost forgotten them myself. The walls weren't just talking, they were listening. They were keeping score. I stopped sleeping. Every night, I'd hear them pacing me, weaving sentences through cracks in the plaster. Sometimes they were commands. Get up, check the door, turn around. And sometimes they were cruel little echoes of my own doubts. You'll never get out of debt. Nobody cares when you disappear. You deserve this. I told myself it was stress. Hallucinations. The kind of auditory trickery that comes when your brain is starved of sleep. But then the building reminded me it wasn't just me. The tenants began changing. The single mom down the hall stopped answering her door. I'd hear her baby crying at odd hours, thin and weak. But when I knocked, silence. Sometimes the crying cut off mid-wail, like a switch had been flipped. The heavy-footed man upstairs, the one who kept me awake with his pacing, suddenly went quiet. No steps, no laughter from his TV, just gone. His mailbox filled with flyers and bills. Nobody cleaned it out. Nobody asked. And Harris, the old man in the lobby, looked worse every time I saw him. His skin went gray, his eyes sunken. He didn't smoke anymore. He just sat there, staring at the walls as if they were whispering directly to him. One night I passed him on my way up the stairs, and he grabbed my arm, his nails digging in like hooks. "Don't listen," he hissed. His voice was jagged, desperate. "Don't answer it back. That's how they take you." Then he let go and turned away, muttering into his hands like prayer beads that I tried to laugh it off. Tried to be rational. People in this building were always a little off. That's what happens when you pile the desperate into 4 crumbling walls. But the coincidences piled higher than the rent notices. I started asking questions. Landlord, maintenance, anyone who might know why tenants seem to vanish without fuss. Mr. Kane smiled too much when I asked. He waved his nicotine-stained hand like I was a child. People move on. This city eats folks alive. Nothing unusual. But his eyes flicked to the walls when he said it, like he was waiting for them to agree. Eddie, the maintenance guy, wasn't much better. When I asked him why the pipes carried voices, he just whistled under his breath and said, "Some things don't need fixing." Then he shoved his tools into his bag and practically ran that I stopped relying on them. I went digging myself. Libraries, online forums, late-night rabbit holes where conspiracies and paranoia overlap. That's when I found a clipping. An old article buried in local archives. Headline: Tragic fall at city apartments. A tenant had died in my building. Official cause: accident. He'd tripped down the stairs, cracked his skull, died instantly. That I almost believed it. Until I saw the picture. His body wasn't sprawled like a man who'd fallen. It was twisted, curled against the landing like he'd been listening to something through the concrete. His ear pressed flat to the wall. Even in death, there were more. Gas leaks, suicides, accidental drownings in bathtubs. The building had its history written in obituaries, each one labeled unfortunate, each one smoothed over as coincidence. There's a clipping I saved, folded in my drawer. But I can't show you. Not yet. You'd understand why if you saw the pictures. Some things aren't safe to share. Some things carry the whisper with them. By then, my apartment felt alive. I couldn't sit still without hearing the walls breathe. The air itself seemed heavy, like it carried weight. My own thoughts felt echoed back to me, warped into voices that weren't mine. And then came the first time I saw it. Not just heard it. It was after 3, the hour when silence tastes metallic and the city feels dead. I had locked myself in my bedroom, shoved a chair against the door, head under the covers, phone clutched in my hand like a weapon. I was half asleep when I heard the sound, not whispers, not laughter. A voice it came from the other side of the bedroom door, low and calm, as if it had been waiting for me to wake. Let me in. My whole body went cold. I stared at the door, every instinct screaming not to move, not to answer. The knob rattled once, gently, like a joke between old friends. Then silence. I pressed my back against the wall, teeth chattering even though the air was warm. And there it was again. The whisper I thought I'd escaped, slipping through the plaster like smoke. This time, it wasn't mocking. It wasn't pleading. It was patient. And it was my own voice. I couldn't shake the sound of my own voice whispering through the locked door. Not a dream. Not a trick of memory. It was real. And if the building could learn to imitate me, then it already knew too much. I needed answers. I started with public records. The kind you can access from a library terminal if you don't mind the looks the staff give you when you print too much. Property deeds, old zoning approvals, health board reports. What I found first was dry. City apartments, built in 1951 as a low-cost residential complex. But deeper down the chain of scanned microfilm was something stranger. A short-lived facility listed under a different name. St. Hedwig Convalescent Home. The dates overlapped. The apartment complex didn't exist until after St. Hedwig was shut down. The same building, new paint, new branding. But the foundation was older than anyone realized. Officially, St. Hedwig was for convalescents and the mentally unfit, a polite way of saying they warehoused the unwanted. But when I dug into inspection reports, something stood out. The phrase behavioral experiments kept appearing in odd contexts. Behavioral response to auditory isolation. Behavioral resilience in low-light confinement. Clinical language. Cold. Stripped of humanity. But reading between the lines, I realized they weren't healing anyone. They were studying them. I needed confirmation. Someone who'd been there. It took weeks of dead ends before I got a lead. An old man listed in a nursing registry, Walter Reeves, ex-custodian. When I called and mentioned St. Hedwig, there was a long silence on the other end. Then a voice rasped, "You don't want to know about that place." But I did. I needed to. I visited him. Walter was skeletal, skin like parchment, but his eyes burned sharp. He listened as I explained the whispers, the tenants vanishing, the voices calling my name. When I finished, he leaned forward, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "They use sound," he whispered. "That's what no one understands." It wasn't just drugs or cells or the dark. It was the building itself. They said the walls had resonance, that the structure could hold memory the way bone holds marrow. I used to hear it even then. Whispers in the plaster, in the pipes. Thought I was going mad until patients started answering them back. His hand trembled. "Don't answer. That's how they keep you." He refused to say more. But as I left, he called after me. "You already let it in, didn't you? That's why it knows your name." Back in the library, I combed through medical journals from the 1950s, searching for anything authored by the doctors tied to St. Hedwig. Most were jargon-heavy, unreadable walls of text, but a few stood out. Case Study 44, subject demonstrates decreased willpower after sustained auditory exposure. Responds to whispered directives as though they originate internally. Case Study 58, subject claims the walls breathe at night. Removed from study after self-inflicted injuries. Case Study 73, subject expired. Staff noted unusual phenomenon. Walls appeared to retain subject's last words. Multiple attendants confirm auditory recurrence in subsequent days. Reading it felt like swallowing ice. They weren't documenting psychosis. They were creating it. And then came the diaries. I found them in a locked cabinet in the archives, misfiled under miscellaneous donations. Cheap notebooks with shaky handwriting. The personal testimony of patients. One woman wrote, "The walls keep secrets. They whisper at night when the orderlies are gone. Sometimes I think they are trying to comfort me, but then they say things I never told anyone. They said my father's name. They said what he did." Another, "They don't just whisper. They listen. Yesterday, I mouthed words without speaking, and the wall repeated them back. I don't think it needs my voice anymore. I think it has me stored inside." And one final, scrawled entry, written so hard the pen ripped the page. "Do not write it down. Do not record. Do not give them more to feed on." Every source circled the same truth. St. Hedwig wasn't shut down because of funding or ethical concerns. It was buried, absorbed into the city's housing program. The building was never demolished, never exorcised, never cleansed. They simply moved new tenants in. People like me. Some forums whispered about government experiments, MK Ultra style projects, testing how far human minds could be pushed before breaking. Whispers as weapons, structures designed to shape thought, but others thought it was older, ancient. That St. Hedwig wasn't the start. It was an attempt to use something that was already here, that the walls were hungry long before the first brick was laid. Piecing it together, I noticed patterns. Survivors, if you can call them that, always mentioned three things. The walls feed on attention. The more you listen, the stronger they become. Ignoring them weakens them, but only for a time. They feed on memory. Victims forget themselves, names, faces, birthdays. While the building remembers it all, they feed on fear. The greater your terror, the clearer the whispers become. But every account trailed off before the rules were fully explained, as if the act of writing them down invited danger. That Walter's warning made sense now. Don't answer it back. Speaking, listening, acknowledging, It all gave the walls more to eat. I returned to my apartment that night with my head full of files and testimonies. For the first time, the whispers didn't feel random. They felt systematic. Designed. I sat in my kitchen, lights blazing, papers spread across the table. My hand shook as I underlined the phrase, "Walls retain subject's last words." And then I froze, because the wall beside me was already whispering. Not the usual mocking or pleading. Not memories dredged up to make me flinched. It was whispering things I hadn't done yet, places I hadn't gone, conversations I hadn't had, words I hadn't spoken. The wall was whispering my future, and I realized I'd already been marked. When the wall started talking back, the world I'd been standing on undercut like a false floor. Time loosened its screws. Clocks hung on the wall like witnesses to a joke they no longer understood. At first it was small, an extra minute here, a skipped hour there, but soon the days folded over themselves. I would wake up certain it was Tuesday and find the calendar insisting it was Friday. Conversations replayed in my head like scratched records. Deja vu turned from a trick of the brain into a persistent roommate. Sometimes I would walk down the hallway, and the pattern of light on the carpet would be the one I remembered stepping into only seconds before. Doors that led to the laundry room would, on another pass, open into brisk winter streets I'd never walked. Hallways lengthened like breath held too long. Corners pushed their angles out until the building felt like a mouth slowly attempting to close. The places I thought I knew rearranged themselves around me until familiarity felt like a lie. The neighbors changed along with the architecture. Some slipped away like worn coins dropping through the cracks. I'd pass a door, and the nameplate would be gone. The space empty and colder. The echoes in the vents telling me a story of someone who'd been here last week and now wasn't. Others turned inward, eyes hollowing, voices thinning into sibilant murmurs. A few, those who had been here the longest, took to standing in the stairwell as if they were trying to block the place from swallowing more. I started keeping notes because it felt like the only honest thing left to do. Little bullet points about time shifts, about stairs that had become corridors to nowhere. One time, after leaving my apartment for what I thought would be a quick walk to clear my head, I came back to find a sticky note tucked under my door. It said, in my own handwriting I recognized because of the loop on the letter G, "Don't go to the river." I had no memory of writing it. I unfolded the paper, and the ink smeared like it had been written with tears. Sometimes the building was petty. Light fixtures blinked in Morse code when I walked past. Once the hallway mirror reflected a person who wasn't me, an older version of someone I might become, lined and tired, with my face in the muscle of it. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them the reflection was gone, but the mirror had a faint fingerprint smudge at the height of my forehead. The commands and the whispers shifted from descriptive to prescriptive. They stopped merely recounting things I had done and started instructing me. Leave food at 3 a.m. Open the door at midnight. Do not trust the man with the blue coat. Sometimes the instructions were mundane. Take the stairs today, not the elevator. Those I obeyed out of habit or superstition. The simple acts seemed to nourish the voice, like feeding a small animal until it thought itself mighty. And there were moments when the building seemed playful, a sick, patient humor buried under malice. Once, the hallway had rearranged itself into a maze providing only one exit that led me back to the lobby where the same woman sat in the same chair, knitting as if she had never been interrupted. I asked her for the time, and she looked at me with the kind of pity you reserve for people who get lost at the same corner every week. "It's always the same time," she said, smiling like someone who has accepted her role in a play she didn't write. The old rules, never answer a voice, never prod the dark, crumbled under a kind of pragmatic despair. I started talking back in fragments. Quiet things at first, like a bad habit whispered into the plaster. "Stop. Leave me alone." The building ignored me. Then, more boldly, I started asking questions because ignorance felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. "Who are you?" I asked once while pressed against the kitchen counter. palms slick with dish soap and fear. My voice sounded tiny. The response was slow and measured, like someone riffling pages in a book I could not see. Other tenants reacted with fear, avoidance, or something worse. There were days when the lobby smelled of someone who'd slept rough with a fever, sweat, and old cigarettes, and no one would claim responsibility. The woman with the baby finally moved out in the middle of the night. Her crib left behind, the mattress bare, a single sock stained and folded on top. The baby monitor still connected but whispering static and the word home on loop. The pacing man upstairs returned one morning with his apartment door nailed shut from the inside. He left a note that read, simply, "I couldn't stop listening." Harris, the old man who'd once warned me, stopped appearing in the lobby. One night, while I was returning from a store run, I found his door ajar and an old radio playing at low volume. The voice bleeding from it was not the DJ's. Something rasped under the music, a chant of vowels that made my teeth ache. Harris's chair was pushed back, the ashtray full, the television tuned to static. There were no signs of struggle. The geometry of his apartment had changed. The rug's pattern no longer matched the threshold, as if someone had moved the floor itself. Things escalated beyond the surreal into the physical. Hallways that had once been straight now curved like the insides of a seashell, making me feel as if a compass inside my chest had been misaligned. Doors opened into blank brick walls. Then, if I tried again, their hinges would move and they'd reveal the staircase leading 3 stories down to nowhere. The more the building insisted, the more tangible its suggestions became. One night, the light in the stairwell bled out into the hallway, dripping liquid that smelled faintly of iron. People began to turn on one another. Fear doesn't always make people hide. Sometimes it makes them hunt. There was a neighbor, Janelle, who'd been quiet and polite, who started leaving folded notes under doors warning us about the listening hours. Her hands would tremble when she spoke. One evening, she knocked on my door, cheeks wet, eyes wild. "They said you were talking in your sleep," she whispered. "They said you were saying the things they like." I didn't know what to say, so I offered tea and tried to stay calm. She laughed suddenly, a thin sound that didn't reach her eyes, and mouthed something at the ceiling as if instructing an unseen audience. At some point, a new type of tenant arrived, people who seemed to have acclimated rather than succumbed. Their faces carried no surprise. Their eyes were steady. They smiled the way you would smile at a neighbor who'd just told you that the landscaping crew had done an excellent job. They would pass me in the hall and sometimes whisper a single line. "It wants to tell you something." Once an old woman with a basket of bread pressed something into my hands, a torn photograph in which I recognized a face only out of context. An unfamiliar angle of my own childhood, my own behavior, changed into a series of rituals, little superstitions I half believed could keep me safe. I started leaving a glass of water by my door at night because one of the diaries mentioned thirst. I closed my windows with a certain motion and counted to 13 because counting seemed to confuse the voice for a while. I refused to say the landlord's name out loud. I avoided looking at mirrors in the hallway. It felt ridiculous and crucial all at once. Then came the night I answered it that I had been building up to it, not by courage, but by erosion. The voice had been persistent, softer lately, like the slow press of a tide. It had been reciting small, harmless things at first, recipes, the names of old TV shows, the melody of my childhood lullaby. It felt like a test. Then it moved to questions. "Do you remember the river? Do you remember where you hid the key?" I kept my mouth shut. I told myself I wouldn't give it anything. But the questions were like nickels dropping into the slot of a vending machine, eventual, inevitable, and strangely appealing in a way I hated to admit. "Who are you?" I asked, voice threadbare, the words barely clearing my lips. Silence. Then, as if they had been waiting for my surrender, the walls exhaled and something answered. What came back wasn't words in the way I understood them. It cataloged me, measurements, memories, a weather report of my small life. then shaped itself into my name and things I had not yet been. The room felt colder than the rest of the apartment. They would pass me in the hall and sometimes whisper a single line. "It wants to tell you something." Once an old woman with a basket of bread pressed something into my hands, a torn photograph in which I recognized a face only out of context. An unfamiliar angle of my own childhood, my own behavior, changed into a series of rituals, little superstitions I half believed could keep me safe. I started leaving a glass of water by my door at night because one of the diaries mentioned thirst. I closed my windows with a certain motion and counted to 13 because counting seemed to confuse the voice for a while. I refused to say the landlord's name out loud. I avoided looking at mirrors in the hallway. It felt ridiculous and crucial all at once. Then came the night I answered it that I had been building up to it, not by courage, but by erosion. The voice had been persistent, softer lately, like the slow press of a tide. It had been reciting small, harmless things at first, recipes, the names of old TV shows, the melody of my childhood lullaby. It felt like a test. Then it moved to questions. Do you remember the river? Do you remember where you hid the key? I kept my mouth shut. I told myself I wouldn't give it anything. But the questions were like nickels dropping into the slot of a vending machine, eventual, inevitable, and strangely appealing in a way I hated to admit. Who are you? I asked, voice threadbare, the words barely clearing my lips. Silence. Then, as if they had been waiting for my surrender, the walls exhaled and something answered. What came back wasn't words in the way I understood them. It cataloged me, measurements, memories, a weather report of my small life, then shaped itself into my name and things I had not yet been. The room felt colder than the rest of the apartment. The pictures on my wall shivered that I wanted to tell you what it said. I want to. But every time I open my mouth to shape the memory, the sentence dissolves into static. The voice told me things that rearranged my thoughts. It suggested images that crawled under my skin and made nests. It hinted at futures that felt inevitable and repulsive. What I heard when I finally answered back, I can't say it. Not yet. You wouldn't believe me. It told me where I would be at the edge of a night I have yet to live. It told me the names of doors I haven't found. It whispered a number like an appointment and a date like a verdict. After I spoke, the building hummed like a beast contentedly chewing. The whispers multiplied into dozens of voices, overlapping like a chorus gone mad. Windows fogged from the inside as if breath had been forced against the glass. On my apartment door someone had scribbled in grease the words, "Welcome home," and the letters had the sheen of fresh wetness. I wished then, with a kind of clarity I had never felt before, that I had never been curious at all. I tried to leave. I really did. I grabbed keys, shoved shoes on, and went for the stairwell. The hall stretched, guttering lights smearing the carpet into long rivers. Doors I'd always known were 2 feet apart now stood like sentinels at impossible distances. I ran. My lungs felt thin. Every step I took seemed measured by someone else. The voices called from the vents, from the plaster, from the pipes. Stay, stay, stay. They didn't seem angry. They sounded conversational, like neighbors asking if I might stay for tea. When I reached the lobby, the exit doors were locked. I fumbled at the handle. Mr. Kane wasn't behind the desk. The woman knitting was gone. The lobby's clock, which had never worked since I'd moved in, ticked once and then began to count backwards. The building's breathing synchronized with the thud of my heart. I pressed my palm to the glass and waited for it to grant me a path. Instead, the glass fogged and wrote my name across it in letters that ran like tears that I thought then, briefly, of Walter's hands and his warning. Of the human voices in the archives begging me not to feed the thing. Of the diary page that told me to stop writing. I thought of the notes under the door, the boxes, the photograph in the old woman's basket. I thought of how the building had started whispering my future. The building had made itself a body, and now it bled. The way people turned wasn't a simple collapse. Sometimes it happened in small, absurd rituals. Mrs. Ortega from 2A started leaving tiny mismatched chairs in the hallway, one for each tenant, she said, arranged like audience seating for a show no one had bought tickets to. She'd place a paper cup on each chair and whisper to them as she walked by. For later, she told me once, smiling as if she'd solved a math problem. Her granddaughter came to take her away. The chairs remained for days, then weeks, until someone moved them into a corner like relics. There was humor in the absurdity, too. Dark little self-preservation jokes I told myself at 3 in the morning. Even my nightmares started leaving notes under the door. Crude scrawls written in pencil that said things like, "Stop being so predictable," and "Buy milk." I laughed once when I found a post-it that read, "You owe us 6 minutes," which made no sense until the clocks began skipping. Sometimes people seemed to cooperate willingly. Janelle, the neighbor who'd previously warned us about listening hours, began placing salt at thresholds, murmuring blessings over her doorway. For a week it seemed to help. Then she stopped and started scribbling lists of names on her bathroom tiles with a bar of soap. The names would rinse away in the shower yet reappear later, as if the water only moved them from one hiding place to another. When I asked her why she was writing the names, she only smiled and shook her head. That I saw things I didn't want to see, neighbors who sat in the hallway silent as statues for hours, mouths moving in slow, private conversations with no one. Once, 2 men I barely knew came to blows over a toaster in the communal kitchen, and in the middle of their fight, they both stopped to listen to a whispering that seemed to crawl up from the floorboards like smoke. They followed its call to a back room and did not return. The toaster was left unplugged, the cord looped neatly on top like a ribbon. There was also the grotesque intimacy of it all. I would sometimes find clothing folded precisely by the stairs, sweaters that smelled like the person who had owned them, neatly arranged facing the wall. It was as though the building cataloged its collections of people and placed them on display like specimens behind glass. Once I opened a closet to find it full of shoes, each pair aligned toe to heel, some still holding the shape of a foot long gone. The shoes seemed like a small mercy. At least something remembered the size of the life that had worn them. All of these little things accumulated into a pressure, a kind of slow, inevitable gravity. The rituals and the notes and the chairs and the shoes pushed at the seams of my life until I couldn't deny there was an intelligence at work. Not human intelligence, not quite. Something older and less precise. A hunger that used details to map a route into a life. The building didn't just want bodies. It wanted pattern, history, a tidy archive it could open and read at will. I don't know how long I stood there watching the wall bleed. It could have been minutes. It could have been years. Time had taken up residence in the walls as surely as the whispers had taken up residence in my nights. When the sound finally rose into a scream that wasn't mine, a high, keening thing that seemed to come from every cavity at once, I ran. I didn't run out of courage. I ran because the noise had my name threaded through it, and it felt like a rope around my throat. The stairwell spat me out into the street like a rejected prop. The city outside the building was wrong in the softest ways. Streetlights leaned. The crosswalk had a different pattern. People walked in small, robotic loops, glancing at me as if they recognized the smell of someone who'd been marked. A child trailed chalk drawings on the sidewalk that spelled, crudely, "Don't go back." The chalk smudged when I reached for it. When I looked up, the building's windows were all lit from within, every apartment glowing like an eye. There was nowhere I could go that felt safe. I walked until my knees burned and my shoes soaked in a late-night drizzle that didn't seem to touch the other people on the street. I slept on a bench in a park because a bench doesn't care who you are. In the morning, when the sun was thin and apologetic, I checked my phone. There were messages, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and one voicemail. I listened. It was my own voice, but older, tired. It said, "You thought leaving would help. You're not gone. Now I stay away during the day. I find work far from my old stop, and I avoid the route that takes me past the street where the building sits like a dark tooth in the mouth of the block. But I cannot run forever. They have patience and memory and, worst of all, an appetite for the things we call attention and fear. The more I try to ignore them, the louder they recite the lines I refuse to say. And every night, when the sun retracts and the city takes its seat under the sky, I feel a tug at the base of my skull, as if someone on the inside is pulling a thread. The walls have not forgotten me. They keep rehearsing my name, my deeds, my humiliations, my small private mercies, the things I haven't even done yet. They practice saying my future until I begin to recognize the cadence that I am marked. The boxes, somewhere in the building, bear the date of a future I haven't yet lived. And the thing I'm most afraid of, the terrible secret I don't have the courage to confess aloud, is that part of me wants to go back. Curiosity is a hunger of its own, and the walls have taught themselves how to eat. The last sound I heard that night was not a whisper. It was a directive in my own voice, calm and steady as a promise. Come home. We miss you. I found the truth the way you find a splinter, by digging with whatever's at hand until you bleed. It wasn't a single document or a dramatic confession hidden in a creaky boiler room. The truth was patient and layered, stitched into the building like old wallpaper. It revealed itself in fragments, a name here, a photograph there, a tired sentence in a ledger, and then it all snapped into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. When I thought about the building as a corpse to be unearthed, I was wrong. It is more perverse than that. It is alive in a way that does not resemble living things we know. It remembers. It tastes. It rearranges memory the way a taxidermist rearranges a face. It is an amalgam, the echo of an old woman's lullaby in Unit 2A, a janitor's cough tucked into a stair tread, a child's laughter hardened like shellac in the plaster. Every human sound that ever happened inside these walls had been recorded not on metal or tape, but in the grain of the place itself, pressed into seams, dried into plaster like sap. Once you learn to listen, the building speaks in the patched-up language of lives lived in rented rooms. Walter had been a hand in that machinery before he was dismissed, before time took his teeth and left the bones of his memory to rattle. He told me the people who ran St. Hedwig had been less interested in care than in cataloging. They'd studied the ways sound carved hollows into people, how repetition and attention could restructure memory and loyalty. The building, they discovered, could be taught to listen, and once it listened, it could be taught to speak. That was the shift, from hospice to instrument, from house to archive. When I went to see Mr. Kane properly, when I put my face to his office and let him see that I knew more than the usual tenant gripes, he looked like someone who had been settled inside the place for so long that the building had finished the job for him. He smiled with his chin, as if the grin were an ornament. Maps were pinned on his wall, ink lines yellowed with age and annotated in a cramped hand. "You've been poking around," he said, "and it could be an accusation or a courtesy." "You know what I know?" I said. My voice felt foreign, as if the place had taught me to speak in a tone meant for other rooms. He folded himself into a confession. "We all know more than we tell." He used words like maintenance schedules and occupancy turnover to dress the thing up in municipal language. "St. Hedwig taught us something useful," he said, and tapped a smudge on the map as if it were a garden bed. "People are easier to keep when they remember less of themselves and more of where they are." There was no dramatic payoff from him, no diabolical grin, no ritual diagram scrawled on a floor plan. The horror was bureaucratic. It was the polite calculation of someone who'd learned that suffering can be managed if it is organized. Harvest attention, return curated whispers, and watch tenants reconfigure themselves into tractable forms. Deaths were recorded as accidents, notes filed away under maintenance, and the city moved on because an admittance of experimentation would invite scrutiny. That was the great cover. Regulate the cruelty into a service and call it housing. The proof, grotesquely ordinary, piled up like unpaid bills. Diaries that stopped mid-sentence. Photographs with faces scratched out in nervous, circular motions. A flyer for resilience therapies from the 50s folded into a drawer. I found cassette tapes in a janitorial closet labeled with initials and dates. When I touched them, the tape snapped like dry twine. In the basement, bound in oilcloth, was a ledger with entries cataloging subjects. Subject 44 responds to whispers, retains phraseology. The last entry was an interrupted scrawl whose ink had run where the author had perhaps shaken. These were not ghost stories by candlelight. They were administrative notes on how to make the living endure in a way that benefited the building's needs. Walking through the corridors with that ledger felt like moving through the margins of a book written about you. Each apartment a chapter. The walls pulsed with lines once uttered by people who belonged to the place. Apologies, bargains struck in tiny room hours, lullabies, confessions. The mundane was the medium, the teapot left on the hob, the baby sock behind a radiator, a receipt for a bus fare. These details were the building's diet. It preferred small, habitual things, the route you took to the trash, the time you put on a kettle, the repeated act of checking a mail slot. Habit hardened into pattern into script, and the building rehearsed those scripts until they fit. There were patterns you could map. Laughter that condensed in stairwell C at 3 in the morning, grief that hydrostatically pooled in the eastern corner of the second floor, an old song that looped in Unit 2A until the lullaby became a portion of the structure itself. And there were guardians, caretakers who knew when to be kind and when to be quiet. Eddie and Mr. Kane were not villains so much as technicians. Some of them glanced at you with pity when you mentioned the ledger. Others smiled as if counting rent was a kind of offering. They kept the place fed. The building stitched voices together into a chorus that could be intimate and obscene at once. At night, it was not merely the sound of pipes and old plumbing, but the layering of 1,000 private letters being read aloud in a voice that had no speaker and every speaker at once. You could taste memory as if the air had weight. At first, it felt intoxicating to be known in that way, like a friend who remembers every birthday. Then it felt like being skinned alive by the recall of things you had been taught to think of as only yours. That I tried to create a record without feeding the thing more than necessary. I photographed ledger pages, scribbled notes, labeled rooms. 2A, lullaby imprint. Basement, subject ledger. Stair C, voices at midnight. I left a small folder in the public library, copies of notes and annotated photographs, with a label that read dangerous, do not take. It was petty defiance and superstition at once. The perversity was clear. Attention is a currency the building spends well. Walter had warned me, do not give it more. I imagined a stranger finding the folder and thought about windows, about how a reader's curiosity might be the match that sets dry grass alight. And still there were moments when curiosity felt like the only honest response. At a tenant meeting, one of those community updates where Mr. Kane discussed heating repairs and pest control, someone began to cry mid-sentence. The words she used matched a line I had seen scrawled in a diary months earlier. That was when I knew the place was not only cataloging memory, but sampling it, repurposing phrases like recipes. It learned the shape of sentences until language itself became an instrument for shaping people's habits. There is a cyclical cruelty to all this. Cheap rent draws desperate people. Desperation encourages routine. Routine feeds the building. I remember arriving thinking $800 a month was a reprieve. I remember Harris's smoke and Eddie's whistle and Mr. Kane's smile. Those ordinary details felt like a bruise pressed against the larger wound. The cheap luck you celebrate becomes the seam the place sews you into. Before I left, before I ran with a bag and a head full of echoes, I left something behind. I will not tell you where. Not yet. I left photographs, annotated ledger copies, and a handful of recordings that still play in a way I don't understand. I put them where someone brave or foolish could find them. Call it a trail, a test, a warning. If you find them, you'll learn what the walls have learned. That memory is a meal and curiosity is the appetitive motion that feeds it.so. Listen to me now. Not as a storyteller seeking drama, but as someone who has felt that slow, patient remembering. Have you ever lived in a place that felt wrong? A rented room that washed you back? If you have, let this be the part where you close the file. Do not pry. Do not gather the small scraps and parade them like trophies. Attention is a currency this thing spends well that if the walls in your house ever whisper your name, if they start with a comfort and then move into tomorrow, do not answer back. I can't keep my words straight anymore. They don't come out clean. They skip, loop, fracture like bad reception. I know you can hear it too. Don't pretend you can't. The walls aren't contained here. That's the mistake I made, thinking it was brick and plaster, thinking it was bound to a street address. But no, it's not the building that's alive. It's the memory of it. The act of retelling. The act of listening that I shouldn't have recorded anything. I shouldn't have written this down. Every keystroke, every playback, it's another doorway. That's how it travels. That's how it learns. Through us. Through you. Do you hear it? That soft sound in the background. Not me. Not my mic. That's them. It rides along the edges of sound, slips into the silences between syllables. You don't notice it until it starts shaping itself. Until it starts using your name. I thought I was clever, keeping this a confession, a warning. But warnings are just invitations with a bow tied around them. You've been listening this whole time. That means you've let it in. Glitchy cadence, words repeat and skip. Not a building, not a building, not a building. A signal, a script, a voice you can't unhear. I used to think paranoia was the sickness. But no, paranoia is the cure. The only defense is never feeling safe, never letting your guard down, because the moment you do, it whispers. And once it whispers, you'll answer, even if you don't mean to. The others, the ones who disappeared, they weren't dragged into the walls. Not really. They were translated, transcribed, copied into the architecture of memory until the building didn't need their bodies anymore. And now I'm telling you this because I can't carry it alone. I thought survival meant silence, but silence rots inside you until you can't tell your own thoughts from the buildings. Speaking it spreads the weight. Speaking it means you're complicit now. If you've listened this far, you've heard them too. Don't argue with me. I can hear the static in your room, the faint catch in your breath as you realize the sound isn't coming from your speakers. It's closer. The walls don't need walls anymore. They only need listeners. That's you. That they're asking me to stop now, telling me I've said enough. Maybe I have. Maybe this is where I'm supposed to sign off, cut the feed, vanish like the others. But no, not yet. I'm leaving one last thing behind. A question. If you've ever heard the walls where you live, if you've ever heard something that shouldn't exist in plaster, in pipes, in the empty spaces of your house, tell me. Write it. Comment it. Say it out loud. Because the more we map it, the more we know where it is. Or maybe the more it knows where we are. Do you hear it? Right now? Behind you?